Good afternoon, everyone. We come to session 18 of the Bible story, and I'm very pleased you're staying the course because the story gets better and better as it goes along. We come this week to Hosea and the end of the northern kingdom. So King Jeroboam II reigned in the northern kingdom of Israel for 40 glorious years of relative peace during the 8th century BCE. Trade had flourished, and the traders became more and more rich to the detriment of the landed farmers, whose lives became more and more impoverished. The rich ignored the poor and let them degenerate into poverty and even slavery when the rich had bought them out of their ancestral lands for a pittance. The social standards of the law of Moses were forgotten. The rich conveniently forgot that long ago their ancestors had all been slaves in Egypt before Moses had led them to freedom in the name of Yahweh. Amos had come and gone, sent packing back to his home in the southern kingdom of Judah, but nothing had happened to change things in the light of his prophetic criticisms. And about 15 years later, another outspoken prophet arose in Israel, Hosea. Like Amos, we would not have become aware of his existence from the political records, but his poems and reflections were collected and preserved separately. We know not how or by whom. And they appear in a book named after him in the Old Testament. At first sight, his poems seem very muddled, but with a key to understanding them, it is possible to feel the passion and the urgency which runs throughout the book. His theological insight saw the relationship of love between Yahweh and Israel, the love as that of a very faithful husband coping with a continually absconding, faithless wife. We know very little about Hosea's background, even less than we know about Amos. The introduction to the collection of his prophetic poems and other writings tells us that he was the son of Beeri, and a vivid description in chapter 7, verse 4, suggests that he was more than usually familiar with the baking trade. But that is all. Like Amos, however, his call to speak boldly in the name of Yahweh came out of his own inner personal experience of life. Hosea's personal life was tragically sad, and it underpinned his whole understanding of Yahweh's relationship with Israel. He loved and married an unfaithful wife called Gomer, who bore him 3 children. In his sadness, he compared his own experience of forgiving his wife and taking her back, only to be forsaken again and again, with Yahweh's similar experience with Israel. Like many fellow northerners, Hosea was well aware of Israel's story, of Yahweh's rescue of his people from slavery with the help of Moses, and the covenant bond, like a marriage commitment between them. Life in the wilderness as Yahweh's people, Hosea realized, had been like their honeymoon before they arrived in Gilgal and settled in the land that Yahweh had promised them. And then, as we know, almost at once they had begun to flirt with the fertility gods of Canaan, the Baals and the Asherah, and enjoyed the attractions of temple prostitution, as Hosea knew only too well. Hosea considered his own feelings of wanting to punish Gomer by rejecting her, and yet, because of his great love for her, he relented and welcomed her back home, even when the pattern repeated itself again and again. This enabled him to understand why Yahweh seemed not to have rejected Israel, but made repeated attempts through history to win her back. The first 3 chapters set the scene, even though at first sight they seem so muddled. Chapter 1 tells us, or sets the scene for all that follows, and is like a living parable. Hosea's wife Gomer repeatedly left him to consort with other men, leaving him to bring up and care for the children. But unbelievably, each time when she returned, he forgave her and took her back, only for this pattern to repeat itself time and time again. The poetic chapter 2 could even have started with the prophetic announcement, "Thus says Yahweh," for it is written as from the perspective of Yahweh himself, speaking to unfaithful Israel. And I quote, "Plead with your mother that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, or I will strip her naked and expose her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and turn her into a parched land, and kill her with thirst. And upon her children also I will have no pity, because they are children of whoredom. For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers. They give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink." And all this spoken as if Yahweh was speaking of Israel and her desertion for the Baal fertility gods. It was only in times of danger, when the Baal gods did not defend her, that Israel, in verse 7, quote, "shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now." And in Hosea's own pathos, he saw the reflection in Yahweh's. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished upon her silver and gold that they used for Baal. Chapter 2 continues with more of the same comparisons. Verse 13 to 15. "I will punish her for the festival days of the Baals, when she offered incense to them and decked herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers and forgot me, says Yahweh." But Hosea realized that Yahweh couldn't do that permanently any more than he could with Gomer. And he continued, as if from Yahweh, I will now persuade her and bring her into the wilderness again and speak tenderly to her. And from there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And there she shall respond as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. Well, this is followed by a passage of prose in chapter 3, in which the extent of Hosea's love for Gomer led him to buy her back from her pimp, and showed him the full extent of Yahweh's love for Israel, the declaration of Yahweh's everlasting love for Israel, his wife. "On that day, says Yahweh, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal." But in using this language, Hosea was skating on very thin linguistic ice. Vocabulary was still fairly limited at this time, and the word Baal, the lord of fertility, also meant the head or lord of the human household, as well as the ancestral fields. It was all rather confusing, and Hosea's insight took many years to be developed and clarified. But for the first time ever, the concept of a loving Yahweh enters the theological understanding of the character of God, and this is very new. Please remember, We've not yet reached the time of Deuteronomy's discovery and its message to love the Lord your God with all your heart and so on. We haven't got there yet. But Hosea's theme is continued in verses in chapter 11. This time, Hosea speaks from the relationship of a father to his dearly loved child. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they didn't know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness and bands of love. That is the old style of walking reins that we used to put onto our children. The bands of love was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. Well, after more vitriol against them, Yahweh continues poignantly in verses 8 and 9. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger, for I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Well, all through these poems, two Hebrew words are used time and time again, but neither of them translates easily into English without losing the full meaning. The first word is hesed. It means more than just love. Its full meaning is more like loving mercy. But it is then even more than merely a virtue. Hesed involves action, something to be done, not just a good feeling. Well, love in action is to do love. And this eventually develops into an act of redemption. The second word is knowledge. It does not mean our Western understanding of all sorts of things, but a very specialized form of knowledge, which acknowledges a very close relationship in a treaty, and also in a close friendship, as between David and Jonathan, or a marriage, for the intimate sexual knowledge that a husband and wife share, that binds them intimately and privately together, even when they're part of a crowd. And we find this all through Genesis. For example, Adam knew his wife and she conceived, and so on and so on and so on. And this is repeated time and time again. That's their understanding of knowledge, that intimate knowledge that is very, very private. But the key verse in the whole book of Hosea is in verse 6 of chapter 6. Yahweh declared, I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Or in other words, no praises are really needed between the mythical Darby and his Joan. This profound and new understanding of God's everlasting love and knowledge has given us the theological picture of Yahweh as the loving God, the loyal husband of a much-loved Israel, and it paved the way for the future. It underpins the whole book of Deuteronomy and was developed a century later by the prophet Jeremiah, and then again in the fullness of time by Jesus himself, and then into our Christian understanding that God is love itself. We do not know anything more about Hosea's story, but the intensity and urgency of the poems suggest that dark clouds were gathering on the political scene as at the end of Jeroboam's long 40-year reign. Jeroboam died in 746, and was succeeded by two short-lived monarchs, Zechariah and Shallum. But in the following 8-year reign of Pekahiah, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III advanced again. He exacted tribute from Israel and Judah soon afterwards. Hosea's poems reflect this danger. In chapters 7 and 9, warning the people that their future would be like returning to the wilderness. But as we have already noted in chapter 11, it would not be forever. This confidence suggests that Hosea did not live to see what would happen to Israel only a few years later. The prophets Amos and Hosea were near contemporaries, along with Isaiah in Jerusalem too, but they were seemingly unaware of each other. Amos and Hosea agreed that Israel had broken her covenant with Yahweh, Amos on the social scene, and Hosea with her adultery with the Baal gods. Both saw punishment from Yahweh on the horizon, but neither could see the total oblivion that was to come. Neither of them gets a mention in Israelite history books, and neither had any effect at the time on the nation's political leaders or public opinion. But fortunately, they were appreciated by some, and eventually, many years later, in retrospect, we are indeed very fortunate that their poems survived at all. Well, back now to the complicated political history of the late 8th century, which had devastating results for both kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And let's meet again. The terror. Tiglath-Pileser III. He was aggressive himself, and he led a very aggressive army that was new. He was transforming his part of the world, doubling the size of his kingdom into a new, large empire. His capital city was Nimrud. That's what's left of its gates. In the northern part of Iraq, maybe not even that still stands after the recent wars that have been raging through that countryside. But it's not far from Mosul. At Nimrud, Tiglath-Pileser built his new palace. It was his only building, as all his other revenues were spent on his military projects and conquests. He spent a lot of money raising a permanent army of professional soldiers who were well paid and supported by many chariots, horses, bows and arrows, and siege weapons for use when he wanted to capture a well-defended city. There's a picture of the sort of decorations that were found at the gates of a city such as Nimrud. This permanent army was quite completely new in the history of the world, as far as we know. And here's a stone carving showing you some of the ferocity of that very professional army. All this was in the name of his god. Let's have a picture. Ashur, the Assyrian winged sun god. Note that it's part of the sun in the sky. We're going to hear a lot more of these constellations and things that were observed in the skies. So Ashur is the Assyrian winged god of the sun. Tiglath-Pileser introduced a new policy for dealing with captured people. He left the women alone, but rounded up hundreds of thousands of men, treated them well, but transported them to places far from home where they would be most useful according to the skills they had, whether as agriculturalists or builders or navigators on the rivers or in the army and so on. They were to settle down permanently in their new homes and establish new families with the local women. And this had the result of reducing possible revenge attacks. It also increased the workforces where they were most needed. All very efficient. It also, in time, led to the spread of the Aramaic language throughout the Middle East. For this new empire certainly had its impact on both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Let's look at our map. A map of the Middle East, and you can begin to see the extent of the huge empire that was being created. Tiglath-Pileser had strayed westwards into Turkey, around the Urartu people who lived near Lake Van. He had stretched southeastwards, down the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, down towards Babylon, and then, with his eyes on the golden prize of Egypt in the south of the Mediterranean, he set out down the Mediterranean coast. And the impact would be felt well and truly along that coastline. So back in Israel, after the death of Jeroboam in Israel, chaos ensued. His son Zechariah lasted for 6 months, bringing to an end the dynasty of Jehu. And then his murderer Shallum lasted for only 1 month before he was killed by Menahem. Now Menahem was a stronger character and survived for 10 years. But during that time, he suppressed all possible opposition in Israel, but quickly recognized the threat from the new strong king of Assyria, and he made overtures to him. He was forced to cede the whole of his northern territory of Galilee to Assyria and pay a heavy tribute every year. The tribute was paid, of course, from taxes taken from the wealthy rich, who soon began to resent their increasing and unfamiliar poverty. They were helpless, however, because Assyria supported Menahem until he died. His son Pekahiah became king, but he was killed 2 years later by Pekah. And he made an alliance with King Rezin of Syria and joined his resistance to the Assyrian demand for tribute. And together, they even went to war with Judah to force Judah to join their rebellion in defiance against Assyria. And altogether, they refused to pay the tribute. Tiglath-Pileser did no more than completely destroy Syria and its capital Damascus in 732 BCE. But then he died and was succeeded by his son Shalmaneser V. No, I seem to have lost Shalmaneser. Well, these are pictures of the Assyrian professional army. Go back. There's the Assyrian invasion as it came. Can you see the figures? They're carved in relief on that stone wall. A fighting force, if ever there was one. Sorry, I've lost my arrow. Oh, dear. That slide shows the sort of battering ram that they'd invented. So their soldiers were covered. They had the battering ram to assault the gates of the city and the walls wherever possible, and they were sheltered from all the archers at the top of the walls trying to shoot arrows into their forces. A terrifying siege battering ram. Well, Syria was captured and destroyed altogether, and sorry, I've missed that part a bit. Shalmaneser V, who continued his father's policies, laid a long siege of Samaria with those forceful weapons that we've just seen. See them again. Terrifying. Samaria had no way of coping with it. And this was because King Hosea had appealed to Egypt for help and not paid his tribute to Assyria. Well, it took 3 years, but Samaria was captured and destroyed in 721, together with the whole kingdom of Israel. Assyria's punishment was severe. Shalmaneser ordered all the Israelite men, 27,000 of them we're told, to be rounded up and deported to various parts of his far-flung empire to settle down far away from home, while thousands of foreign men were imported to become tenants and new husbands to all the women left in Israel. Life would never be the same again, and neither would be the whole of the Middle East. And all this is described in the second book of Kings, chapter 17. The newcomers in Israel settled down, but they soon became rather scared. They didn't know the God of this new land, where lions roamed freely and dangerously. And they pleaded with a priest of Bethel to teach them how they should worship the God of the land, Yahweh. But of course they had brought their own gods from home as well, their carved images. And the records say this continued to this day. Samaria was then incorporated into the Assyrian province of system and became Samaria. The remnants of the Israelite army, plus all their chariots, were drafted into the Assyrian forces for their next campaign towards Egypt. And of course, the southern kingdom of Judah was on the way. Fortunately, some people managed to escape from Israel into Judah, taking with them some of their treasures and their writings, their historical records, the E-Code with its emphasis on the law of Moses and its unique demand to worship Yahweh and no other gods, together with all the social requirements for Yahweh's people. We have no idea how many poems or psalms, like Psalm 45 that we've met with in the wedding hymn of Ahab and Jezebel. We have no idea how many psalms they took with them, but they must have included some at least of the poems of the prophets Amos and Hosea, which survived for us in Judah. Well, the southern kingdom of Judah survived longer because it was off the beaten track and much poorer, but it didn't escape. Tribute was demanded from their king, whose tiny kingdom was the next target for the mighty Assyrians as they pursued their ambitions towards Egypt. But that will be our story for next time. Next time on Sunday, the 13th of November, and it will be the second of 3 Sundays on the trot in order to keep up the momentum of these dangerous events in the southern kingdom. We shall then meet again the following week, the 20th of November, and lastly, the 4th of December, before all the Advent activities which precede Christmas require the use of this church and all of us too, in the busy preparations for Christmas and the New Year. I'll see you next week. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and thank you wherever you are for joining in. Good night, goodbye.